We're going to move on now to Catriona Baird, who is textiles curator at Paisley Museum. She'll be talking about revisiting the Paisley pattern in the post-colonial era for new museum displays. Catriona has wide-ranging experience as a freelance project and venues-based curator specializing in textiles and exhibitions, with a particular interest in research involving communities and collections to develop new or previously missing perspectives and narratives. Welcome, Catriona, over to you.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for this opportunity to speak about our work on Paisley pattern. We've been reflecting on its history and significance, particularly in relation to accurately representing its complex industrial story for diverse contemporary audiences in our new museum displays. The Museum of Paisley opened in 1871, and the collection we now hold comprises over 350,000 objects, representing aspects of life in the town and surrounding Renfrewshire area. This includes a large collection of textiles with particular focus on the local shawl industry of the 19th century, which was a significant industry in the town and is one of the aspects of its history that is best known. The museum is currently undergoing a major redevelopment project involving refurbishment of the buildings and the development of over 100 new displays of the whole collection, but including displays of the shawls, related weaving technology, and contemporary Paisley patterned objects. You can see one of our architect's design images here of what the building will look like when it's all finished and will reopen. Next slide, please. So the museum collection contains over 1,200 shawls, including examples which were made in Paisley and the other shawl weaving centres in the UK and across Europe. These were produced mainly in the 1800s at the height of the British Empire. We also have a number of cashmere shawls. And to give you a very brief summary of the international shawl story, woven and embroidered shawls with what we know as Paisley pattern were first produced in various parts of the Persian Empire from about the 1500s onwards, and traditionally worn by men. The most exclusive shawls were worn by high-ranking individuals, including the Mughal emperors. Through trade routes, the designs were picked up by skilled weavers in Kashmir, who produced finely woven shawls using cashmere goat hair. These beautiful shawls arrived in Europe in the late 1700s, brought back as gifts by diplomats and military personnel, as well as via the East India Company, and they became very exclusive and highly sought after fashion accessories here for wealthy women. The particular weaving method that was used by the weavers in Kashmir was very time consuming, and there was huge demand for the shawls in Europe. Therefore, weavers here began to try to copy the Kashmir shawls using Western weaving technology and fibres. These became known as imitation Indian or Oriental shawls. And at that stage, the association with South Asia was seen as exotic, quite a problematic word nowadays. They were seen as very exclusive shawls. These could now be seen in some ways to relate more to the idea of othering another culture. But this aspect at the time was seen as an early marketing approach to sell shawls when foreign travel and meaningful awareness of the different culture was unusual in the general population. John Morgan of Co, of some examples here of products from this company. They were one of the leading manufacturers of this type of shawl in Paisley. John Morgan Company worked to develop knowledge and technology to produce increasingly more complex designs as the fashions for shawls changed, which they did during different phases of the over 100 years that they were at the height of fashion. The shawl on the right is typical of the most highly patterned shawls that were developed in the town by the mid-1800s. So round about sort of 1840 up to 1855 was the real height of the industry, and the pattern's very complex and detailed at that point. Next slide, please. As part of our research work we're undertaking to develop new displays of the collection, we're looking afresh at the pattern and its origins, including links with empire and colonialism. This involves reflecting on the international sources of the pattern itself and the trade systems which were in place to bring the original cashmere shawls bearing the teardrop shape to Britain. We're looking at the complex and often difficult history associated, such as that of the wide-ranging and often controversial methods of the East India Company particularly in relation to local industries and communities. During the time this trade in shawls was happening, the British were increasingly present in India, with many controversial aspects of the empire's activities in the region happening about this time. And just to give one example, Baird Shah II, who was the last Mughal emperor in India, was exiled in 1858 at the age of 82 by the British after a failed Indian uprising against the British East India Company. Obviously, it's a very detailed and complex history. That's just one example. Next slide, please. On the left are photographs of shawl borders designs from Kashmir. These were used as design reference in the French shawl trade. There was a very well-established shawl trade in France and also in other parts of the UK, in Norwich and Edinburgh being other shawl weaving centres. On the right is a Kashmir shawl from the museum's collection. This is a typical pattern actually of the early 1800s. I've got a mistake on my slide there, I should say early rather than late 1800s. But it's very typical from the sort of early Kashmir shawls with this distinctive patterned border and quite a plain centre. So the shapes on the midges on the left are what we know as Paisley pattern or the Paisley teardrop. There were and are, however, many different words associated with the motif or patterns containing the motif in different countries and cultures around the world. This is something that we're looking to cover and highlight in the new displays. Next slide, please. These are images of shawl weavers in both Kashmir and Paisley at roughly the same time. Skilled artisans in both places producing shawls. The trade wasn't a linear process, with preferences in shawl designs in Europe impacting on shawls being commissioned in Kashmir, and some designs being produced in Europe with design features which copied the particular twill tapestry weaving technique used in Kashmir. During our research, we have been looking at cultural links, asking questions to consider whether cultural appropriation was significant in the adoption of the patterns and designs in the West, looking at to what extent the traditional meanings of the pattern were known by those adapting and changing the designs for the European market. Thousands of imitation shawls were produced in Paisley. Due to the business methods of the shawl manufacturers in the town, such as division of labour for the many specific tasks involved in producing and finishing the shawls, production in the town around about the 1840s outstripped everywhere else. So gradually the term Paisleys became used as a description for the shawls themselves, and then in relation to the teardrop shape or any pattern incorporating it. Next slide, please. This is the Glasgow Gurdwara Tapestry Group in October 2019. And they're one of the groups who we worked with as part of our research with communities locally in Paisley and Glasgow to find out about their knowledge of the pattern, its international origins, and particular connections that they might have with it. We've undertaken research with local South Asia diaspora communities, including groups who have specific cultural associations with the pattern through their family histories and contemporary networks in India and Pakistan. We commissioned Claire McDade, a freelance heritage researcher in Glasgow, to undertake some focused sessions with groups in Glasgow, also including Glendale Women's Cafe and the Almizan Sakina group, to discuss the pattern with them and gather their ideas and suggestions in relation to telling the story of the pattern and how we go about the interpretation. In the timescales we had available for this particular piece of research, it was all women's groups that we were talking to, but we are looking at ways to gather feedback from men in local South Asian communities as well. We received very interesting feedback from the women about their experiences and connections to the pattern and its importance in their own lives. Some of the group members were unaware of the shawl industry in Paisley and the fact that this was the reason why the motif is called Paisley in the English-speaking world. Lots of the participants used the Punjabi term ambi, but also referred to it as Paisley pattern. And we also found some generational differences in relation to maybe old generations calling it ambi and young people Paisley, but there were variations across all the groups that we spoke to. Next slide, please. So both Glendale's Women's Cafe and the Almizan Sakina group visited the textile store of Paisley Museum in January this year. Seems like a very long time ago now. They came to see the shawls and the pattern book collections. We had further discussion about the history of the pattern, as well as its use on contemporary textiles now being produced in India and Pakistan, including embroidered, woven and printed fabrics. There was also discussion about the use of the teardrop shape as part of traditional henna patterns on hands, especially for brides, and rangoli patterns at doorways for South Asian festivals. Next slide, please. Another aspect of research we did during summer of 2019, we organised some creative workshops, drop-in sessions at a community space in the Piazza shopping centre in Paisley, working mainly with local families, including those who said they weren't usually museum visitors, to find out their knowledge of the pattern and their ideas in relation to it. We were gathering initial feedback at this stage rather than undertaking systematic empirical research. And the weather at this point was very good. We were doing the workshops, so unfortunately the sessions were not as well attended as we might have hoped, but we did gain valuable feedback about people's level of knowledge of the pattern and their experience of it in their own lives. Overall, the workshops was pride in the pattern and its historical connections with Paisley, but probably less awareness of the international story and origins. Comments we received included things such as, I know the pattern from clothing. Unfortunately, I didn't know anything about the history of the pattern, but would be interested in finding out more. The pattern is used on logos for various community organisations in Renfrewshire, so many people had associations related to these without necessarily having awareness of the textile or international story connected with it. There's also pride in the pattern's connection with the town and reflection on objects, including items of clothing that people had with particular meaning, memories or associations for them. We want to avoid any preconceived ideas we may have about the levels of knowledge of the pattern as we're developing the interpretation and sort of trying to find out what people know about it. There's always more for us to learn and discover as well. Next slide, please. Another aspect of our research has included work with Dr. Suchitra Chowdhury, who's an independent academic originally from India, on how the pattern and Paisley shawls are represented in literature of the 1800s. Suchitra was hoping to be here today. Unfortunately, she couldn't be, but she's been working with us on looking at particular shawls in her collection, which have clear similarities to both cashmere and Paisley shawls, as described in various books, including the works of Sir Walter Scott, Wilkie Collins, and Elizabeth Gaskell. There are fascinating details of how particular types of shawls were described in the literature to convey social aspirations, character, or emotions, sometimes almost as if the shawls have character or life of their own. There are also interesting details about how India and the trade processes are described in the books. We've then been making connections between particular literary extracts and specific shawls that we have in the collection with a view to planning our future displays relating to these. And final slide, please. So further elements of our research include looking at how the pattern is used in contemporary culture, often completely unrelated to Paisley the town, cashmere or textiles. Some examples include the pattern used on cars and colouring books, tattoo designs and all kinds of packaging. This will be part of an ongoing conversation with visitors and communities after the museum reopens. The fact that the pattern is hugely versatile and doesn't actually belong to Paisley or anywhere else is one of the great things about it. It can be traced back to objects from the Iron Age, including the Wandsworth Shield, and conversely appears on new patterns for face masks currently being worn in the pandemic. I thought I'd end on a quote from one young person of South Asian heritage who provides feedback on the pattern as part of our consultation. And they said, "I personally love the fact that there's a pattern that represents both sides of me. As I was born in Scotland, I feel a connection to both cultures. So it's really interesting to have a pattern that represents both. I do feel proud of the pattern because it's a representation of both cultures that I feel a sense of belonging to." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona. That was really, really interesting. I think there's almost a temptation to ignore things such as textiles and soft furnishings as a means of communication about legacies from different cultures within our own culture. And I think the Paisley is really interesting because it's so imbued in a lot of Scottish culture. You see the Paisley pattern turning up and people not understanding that it's not actually from Paisley originally. And I'm wondering, just very briefly, if you can talk to how that's going to be incorporated in the new plans for Paisley's museum.
And we were looking at lots of different forms of interpretation, but including, interviews with people and their own personal experiences from all different audiences and groups and communities. with different, film elements and, animations, and just trying to convey that, the kind of huge picture and how international it actually is, and why it ended up being called Paisley.
I think its ability to transcend the typical museum visitor, which is something that you picked up on your interpretation, is really, really valuable. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how that's managed when the museum actually gets opened in a little while. Thank you very much, Catriona, for that. If you have any questions for her, she'll be back for the chat briefly.